Good morning, guys. It's Miss Stevenson, and we are going back to Wayside School for chapters 14 and 15. As you can see, we're about halfway through our book, so that's exciting. So in chapter 14, a light bulb, a pencil, a sharpener, a coffee pot, and a sack of potatoes. Let's see what all those have in common. Galileo was a great scientist, said Mrs. Drizzle. He was born in Italy in 1564 and died in 1642. He was the first person to use a telescope to study the stars, and he also helped figure out the laws of gravity. Oh, I know about gravity, said Joe. Mrs. Jules pushed the computer out the window. It fell a lot faster than a pencil. I don't think so, said Mrs. Drizzle. Galileo proved that all objects fall the same speed. He conducted a very famous experiment. He dropped lots of different objects off of the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy. Todd raised his hand. You're getting a little boring, he said. Oh my goodness, am I? Said Mrs. Drizzle. Rondi, Leslie, Paul, and Calvin nodded their heads. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Drizzle. She thought a moment. I know. Let's do the experiment here. The children cheered. They loved experiments. Mrs. Drizzle rubbed her hands together. Let's see, we'll need a coffee pot, a pencil sharpener, a light bulb, and she thought, we need something heavy. An elephant's heavy, said Benjamin. There are no elephants in Wayside School, said Mrs. Drizzle. Everyone laughed. How about a sack of potatoes, asked Ron. I bet Miss Mush has one. Go see, said Mrs. Drizzle. There's a coffee pot down in the office, said Stephen. Go get it, said Mrs. Drizzle. If I had a screwdriver, I could get the pencil sharpener off the wall, said Eric Fry. I've got a screwdriver, said Jenny. Can we use a fluorescent light bulb, asked Bebe as she looked up at the ceiling. I guess so, said Mrs. Drizzle. How do I get it? You're the scientist, said Mrs. Drizzle. You figure it out. Bebe put her chair on top of her desk and stood on it. She still couldn't reach the ceiling. Hey, Benjamin, let me have your chair. She put Benjamin's chair on top of hers, but she still wasn't tall enough. Calvin, dumped the wastebasket onto the floor. Try this, he said. Bebe turned the trash can upside down and put it on top of Benjamin's chair. Then she climbed on top, but she still couldn't quite reach. Leslie brought the class dictionary. Jenny, and Dana donated their math books. Sherry grabbed Mrs. Drizzle's old blue notebook. Put that down right now, yelled Mrs. Drizzle. Sherry dropped the notebook, and Mrs. Drizzle's kindly face had turned mean. Don't ever touch that again, Mrs. Drizzle ordered. Sherry returned trembling to her seat. Everyone was staring at Mrs. Drizzle. She smiled sweetly. Go back to what you were doing. Jason threw Bebe his lunchbox. She sat on top of the books and climbed on. Standing on the tiptoes, she was able to pull the cover off the fluorescent light. She grabbed the light just as the pile collapsed underneath her. She fell triumphantly, holding the unbroken light bulb above her head. Ron returned with a sack of potatoes. Stephen returned with a coffee pot. Eric Fry unscrewed the pencil sharpener from the wall. Mrs. Drizzle wrote coffee pot, sack of potatoes, pencil sharpener, and light bulb on the blackboard. We're going to drop all four objects out the window at the same time, she said. How many people think the coffee pot will hit the ground first? Is there coffee in it? Asked John. It's about half full, reported Stephen. 8 kids thought the coffee pot would hit the ground first. 16 thought the sack of potatoes would hit the ground first. 3 thought the light bulb would be first. Only Terrence thought the pencil sharpener would hit first. Jason, Jenny, Joe, John, and Joy were the judges. Mrs. Drizzle had sent them outside. Stephen held the coffee pot out one window. Bebe held the light bulb out another. Eric Fry held the pencil sharpener. And Ron held out the sack of potatoes. Everyone else crowded around to watch. With everyone on the same side of the classroom, the school leaned just a little bit, just like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Go, on your mark. Get set. Let go, said Mrs. Drizzle. The objects fell through the air and smashed against the pavement. A short while later, the judges returned. Their clothes were splattered with coffee. Jenny had bits of potatoes in her hair. Was the pencil sharpener first? Asked Terrence. It happened so fast, said Joe. They all hit about the same time. But the coffee pot made the coolest explosion, said Jason. I think the light bulb hit the ground last, said John. Well, that's possible, said Mrs. Drizzle. Gravity causes all objects to fall at the same rate, but the air slows them down. That's called air resistance, and that's good. Otherwise, raindrops would kill us. Oh, excuse me. Air resistance slows all things down a little bit, but it has a greater effect on the very light objects, such as paper. And of course, the shape of the paper is important too. A crumpled up piece of paper will fall faster than you're getting boring again, said Mac. Mrs. Drizzle stopped talking. Now we need a new pencil sharpener, said Leslie, and Paul licked her ear. She finally said pencil, and he finally got to lick her ear. All right. An Elephant in Wayside School, Chapter 15. The bell rang for recess, and the children exploded out of the building. That's a pretty good adjective. That's a pretty good to describe how you guys all run out of the building at recess time. You explode out of it. Louis, the yard teacher, was ready with a big pile of red and green balls. The kids called, "Hi, Louis," and "Over here, Louis," as he tossed the balls to them. Over his shoulder, behind his back, through his legs. Dee Dee came charging out of the building. Usually, by the time she got to the playground, there were no good balls left, but she could see one red ball by Louis's foot. She knocked over a kid from the 10th floor and shouted, "Hey, Lou!" Suddenly she stopped. She had just remembered where she'd heard of Mrs. Drizzle. It was from Louis. He had once told her about the meanest teacher he'd ever had when he was a kid. She hurried over to her friends to make sure. "Hey, Todd," she called. Todd was playing tetherball with Ron. As he turned to look at Dee Dee, the ball came around and bonked him on the head. "Do you remember when Louis told us about the meanest teacher he ever had?" asked Dee Dee. Todd shook his head. After being conked by the tetherball, he couldn't remember anything. "I remember," said Jason, who was in line to play. "Whenever Louis got in trouble, the teacher used to put the waste paper basket on his head." "That's right," said Jenny, "and then Louis would have to keep it there the rest of the day, and everyone would laugh at him, and then the teacher would call on him to answer questions from the blackboard, but he couldn't see the questions, so she gave him an F." "Do you remember the teacher's name?" asked Dee Dee. Her friends shook their heads. Todd couldn't even remember his own name. "I think it was Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee. They ran to Louis. "Hey, Louis," said Jason, "what was the name of that mean teacher you once had when you were a kid?" "Which one?" asked Louis. "The one that put the trash can on your head," said Jenny. Louis shuddered just thinking about her. "Mrs. Drizzle," he whispered. The kids looked at each other. "What color hair did she have?" asked Jason. "Brown," said Louis. "Why?" "We have a substitute teacher," explained Dee Dee. "She's real nice." "Oh, good," said Louis. "Her name is Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee. "Whoa, I'm getting out of here," said Louis. He started to run, but the kids grabbed him. "It's okay," said Jenny. "It can't be the same teacher. Our teacher is nice." "And her hair isn't brown," said Jason. "It's white." Louis relaxed a little bit. "You want to come up and meet her?" asked Dee Dee. "No way," said Louis. "Oh, you're so silly, Louis," said Dee Dee. "She's not the same teacher. And besides, you're a teacher now, too." "Oh, yeah, I forgot," said Louis. "Come on, Louis," said Dee Dee. She held his hand and led him up the stairs. They entered the classroom. Mrs. Drizzle was putting some of the children's work on the bulletin board. "Mrs. Drizzle," said Dee Dee, "we brought our yard teacher up to meet you." "It's very nice to meet you," said Mrs. Drizzle, as she pinned up Joe's math test. "Exercise is so important for the young minds and bodies." She turned around. Louis's face paled. "Well, it was nice to meet you," he said quickly. "I gotta go, bye." "Stay right where you are, Louis," ordered Mrs. Drizzle. He froze. Mrs. Drizzle slowly walked to her desk. She picked up the old blue notebook. "The notebook," whispered Louis. Mrs. Drizzle opened it and flipped through the pages. "Ah, here we are," she said. She removed a piece of paper and handed it to Louis. "Is this your homework?" she asked him. Louis looked at it. "You were supposed to copy it over, weren't you?" asked Mrs. Drizzle. "That was over 15 years ago. I don't remember," said Louis. "Oh, I do," said Mrs. Drizzle. "Oh, now I remember," said Louis. "I was going to copy it over, but then my pencil broke, so I went to sharpen it, but the pencil sharpener fell on my foot, so I had to go to the hospital." "I don't want any of your famous excuses, Louis," said Mrs. Drizzle. "I just want the homework. You may share Dee Dee's desk." Louis sat next to Dee Dee. "And remember, Louis," said Mrs. Drizzle, "I know your tricks." Dee Dee watched Louis struggle with his homework. "Sorry, Louis," she said. Don't be sorry, said Mrs. Drizzle. It's for his own good. And I expect neatness, Louis, or else you'll just have to do it again. He frowned. Mrs. Drizzle stood over him and watched him work. Your fingernails are filthy, she said. I'm the yard teacher, Louis tried to explain. I spend a lot of time outside in the grass and dirt and stuff. No excuses, said Mrs. Drizzle. I want clean fingers, and while you're at it, shave off that mustache. It looks like a hairy caterpillar crawling across your face. Not my mustache, said Louis. Unless you want me to rip it off for you, said Mrs. Drizzle. Dee Dee felt terrible. I can't believe Mrs. Drizzle still remembers you after all this time, she said. An elephant never forgets, muttered Louis. I heard that, said Mrs. Drizzle, and she put the waste paper basket on Louis's head. Oh, poor Louis. So I guess she did remember him, and it was the mean teacher that he had growing up. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow for our final art project of the school year. All right, have a great day, guys. Enjoy the sunshine. Bye.